My father died of AIDS on April 15th, 1989, when I was just 2.5 years old. Since then, my mother has been too fearful of moving away from the spaces which were familiar to her. As a result, I have lived in the same neighborhood in the same street for the past 2.5 decades of my life, in an assortment of apartments along the same strip. Consequently, the space has been a living, breathing entity in which time expands and retracts on itself. The body being the space I grew up in San Diego, in a neighborhood called North Park, and the time being how the space has transformed. Today, its aggressive gentrification, which took place in the late 2000s, paved the way for hipsters and artists to take over the once retired community. However, certain artifacts remain the same and unchanged since 1989. My mother, consequently, recounts these memories whenever we pass through a certain part of the neighborhood. Simple things like cracked pavements, donut shops, Mediterranean cafes, all have a part in the arteries within this timed body. As a young child, I would fantasize about these spaces, which retained both an emotional and psychological memory buried within the confines of those paved areas. They were simply decaying monuments which held more significance than one would ordinarily assume the object to have. I began to venerate these spaces as I created my own memories of those locations. As such, I built up these spaces with such intent idealization that I never dare near the space in fear that those mythologized spaces would disintegrate upon rationalizing their stories. I became enthralled with the idea of how a space would serve as a space-time capsule, both preserving and transporting back to a time in which the body was nearer, in which the body or limb brought you close to the heart of that space, the heart being where the memory sprung and where it was preserved. I used the space as a way to understand how my own family structure had evolved and how its significance of those initial collective memories of our ancestors served as a benchmark for us to understand and evolve. Growing up in a paranoid, fearful household due to the disease my father had died of when I was younger, we spent the majority of our time in enclosed areas. The spaces buried between hospital rooms, government buildings, and our small one-bedroom apartment. All those spaces were transitory, and one was permanent. I began to reflect on my time spent in those spaces and how its construction and surface caused a certain degree of anxiety and nakedness, which the subject experienced while waiting for some sort of event to take place. These places were about permission. The psychology of the space taught us patience, control, tension, and acceptance. They taught people how to wait. The spaces outside of formal establishments taught us leisure and relaxation. That means that these meanings would change and be remembered with bittersweet recollection as one reflected how these once joyous places decayed into something sour. I began photographing these places. I needed to understand how people function within the map within their internalized bodies. As such, the space transformed within each person's spatial memory. Only carcasses remained, most oftentimes, but the signifier of the land still existed when everything had been wiped clean. As such, I realized it wasn't the physical monument which mattered, it was the experience and the land attached to that place which mattered. The memories were not the places, rather the contents inside the places, like a time capsule box. These ideas remained within the core of memory or the core of the building and its infrastructure. To me, spatial memories were purely based on my emotional connection to the object. The water tower near my house was just that for me. It was a constant in an overly changing environment. While the variables around were constantly shifting with both the fluctuating economy and the fleeting community, certain body parts remained the same. My mother had been diagnosed with both trichinosis and hydrocephalia in the mid-90s when I was 8 years old. As a result, I began to watch the world as a giant brain and the functionality which allowed the body to move and adapt to these shifts. I became interested in cognitive science and neurobiology, and the way one can trace back an understanding on how perception changes environmentally and biologically. This was a space I existed in. It was filled with decay and disease, and because of that, they were the contaminants which had tainted and heavily weighted these spaces with memory. While my mother had lost her ability to retain detailed information, the emotional aspect of space had caused her to remember moments spent with my father before he had passed away. These spaces and restrictions they were limited to created a unique sensation associated also to other senses and temperatures. To me, memory lay in warmer temperature, the so-called golden age, where time was plentiful and unused. But as time drags on the body of the space, the shades of golden paint began to chip off, rusting it away. I watched my family transform as what I coined prolonged cabin fever. It had created a space that existed beyond the years its body could retain. Being inside the space deteriorated the body of both the person and the space. As the person became part of the ripples of memory, they would disintegrate within the body. The mind begins to crumble and gives in to the space, and as a result loses a sense of humanity when the space takes over the person. This is where the psychology of space becomes a passive and active agent. The active agent allows collisions to take place and absorb the person's negative energies, which affect only those aware of the memory collisions. The passive agent becomes a nostalgia from afar, which can allow detachment and attachment on command. It can shift and does not require it to become all-consuming. My family became passive agents, corroding with the spaces. It was only after their removal that they became free from the time capsule which corrodes the mind and body. However, my mom remained in the space. Her occupations would only distract her from the beating heart of the space which demanded constant reflection on that space and its memory. I would sit and watch the space and imagine the golden age and how it transformed the spatial memory within my family's cognitive map. As I reflected more and more, I decided I wanted to go back to that body, which my body had escaped from. I retraced the places I had lived at before, and remembered actively the passive events while still existing in those space. Mostly, I remember the infantile awe of watching events unfold as they were taking place in that space. I remember the sounds of grease heated in the stove, the sound of the television as my brother sat and watched the Disney Channel, the sounds of the back door jiggling as an intruder tried to break in during Christmas Day. It was a mixture of happiness and sadness, bittersweet. The memory was filled with an unaware awareness as I existed in the cusp between both time frames. The memories of a child unknowing and the anxiety of an adult understanding. Each space contained their own narrative, and yet they connected as a body as they were the spaces which we would frequently travel from one space to the next. As such, my thesis became a personal, intimate examination of how a dying body created new living bodies of memory, and the manner in which these new bodies affected the organic living memory within each living individual. By filming on Super 8, I captured the beauty of the Golden Age, which existed at the beginning of my own understanding of memory and the remembrance of memory of my elders. Together, they created a new reality for myself, in which the time capsule began integrating the said and unsaid elements of space.